Good to see everybody today. We have some guests with us, and we're happy about that. If you would please stay around for a little while afterwards so we can get to meet you. But good to have you all here today. We're in the 1 Corinthians letter, and we'll be in chapter number 7 of that. Before we get started, good news. Anybody have any good news? We're here. We're getting some rain. Anything else? All right, how about prayer requests? I got a few here to begin with. I just found out that Sister Elaine Earhart is in the hospital, HCA downtown. Don't know the room number. She evidently passed out and has some type of infection. Your servant Paul wrote to our brethren in Corinth some very important things for us that we need to learn from that letter on how to be faithful to you and how to continue to do your work. Be with us, Father, in all we do, and again, help us always to be more like Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. All right. As I said, we're in 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter. We're going to be studying mainly verses 1 through 16. As I've told you before, this is kind of a topical study of the different things that the Apostle Paul talks about in his letter to the Corinthian brethren. Look at the first phrase of that first verse in chapter 7. It says, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me." What does that tell us? They wrote. They had some questions, evidently, or at least some comments about how things were going. And they wrote that to Paul to get his input on those things which they had questions about. Remember how long Paul was in Corinth? About a year and a half. He was in Corinth about a year and a half. Remember, the Lord appeared to him in a vision and told him to stay in Corinth. And remember why? Remember, Corinth was such a wicked city. Why did the Lord tell Paul to stay there? Because he had many people there. He told Paul, "I have much people here." So Paul had a great work to do because Jesus said there's a lot of people here that are going to be attentive to your word and be followers of mine. So he stayed there about a year and a half. But even in a year and a half, Paul didn't answer all the questions they had. They had problems after he left. They had questions about how to handle some of those problems, and so they wrote to him. So we know that there was a letter from them to Paul. We're going to. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And as next question, it says, remember the description of Corinth. What was Corinth like? A corrupt city. Yeah. It was a seaport, remember? And so it was a kind of a crossroads for all different kinds of people. And it was extremely corrupt. Were they religious? Well, yes and no. Yes and no. At least not to our God. They were not. But they had all kinds of gods. And so it was a very corrupt place. Ideas from all over the world there. And what was one of their chief characteristics about the relationship of men and women? Say again? A free-for-all. That's right. It was a free-for-all. Prostitution was rampant. Remember, they even had at least one, maybe more temples devoted to that, to prostitution. Brother?
Their debauchery or whatever was their religion.
That's right. Yeah.
They kind of merged. It wasn't religion
Yeah.
to be as whatever.
Yeah.
More to be.
I remember we told that women of low repute were often called Corinthian women. It was a common phrase during that time because of the wickedness that went on in that city. So it was a extremely wicked city, and imagine the Lord saying, I have many people here. You know, Paul had a great work to do there, and he did. And so there was a functioning congregation of the Lord's people there, although they did have their problems, as we have seen and will continue to see. Going on in the first verse there, what does Paul mean when he says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman? Okay, not have sex? Okay. Say again? With unmarried. Okay. Okay. And he's going to go ahead and talk about that here in just a minute. But again, it was so prominent in Corinth that Paul had to remind these folks. You know, that's one of the things about Christianity. Sexual activity is only allowed within the marriage relationship. Okay? But he says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Does he mean that it's not good to be married? Okay. Okay, so it's good for a man not to touch a woman outside of the marriage relationship, is what he's meaning. Oh yeah. As I said, the letter is written to them, but it's for us to look and gather what we need to from that. And it tells about the principles that God has laid down. And that's one of the principles that God has laid down. Yep. Okay, he's already talked about fornication earlier in the chapter we just completed. So, what reason does he give for marriage? Say again, I'm sorry. To avoid fornication, exactly. That's the reason he gives. Now, are there other reasons for marriage? Sure. Procreation. Remember in the beginning, when God made man and woman, he made them to be together. And he said, this is good. That was God's purpose. But in this case, Paul is saying, if you can't avoid touching women, get married. Okay. Was it good? He'll go on in just a minute, but was it good for somebody not to be married at this time? Yep, yep. And he'll explain why as we go on in these verses. Okay. What did he say about himself? Exactly. Yep. Yep. Later on in our study this morning, he's going to go into that. It's better not to have a wife. He says it's better for you to be like me. What type of well, first of all, what is marriage and who is involved, rather? What is marriage and who is involved? First, what is marriage? Okay. A man and woman being together, it's a commitment they make to be together. How does God describe it? They're of one flesh. When man and woman are joined in marriage, they become one flesh. And so that's what marriage is all about. What specifically does he say about that? Who is involved? A man and a woman. Okay? Contrary to popular opinion and belief, God says it's a man and a woman. Okay. What ground rules does Paul present for a marriage relationship? He talks about it here and he sets kind of some ground rules. Okay, being faithful. Says a man should have what? His own wife. A man should have it, and a woman should have her own husband. That's singular. One and one. No, none of this other junk that our society likes to throw in there. It's between a man and a woman. What else in the relationship? What else can you say from this passage? Okay. Okay. All right. She said it's only with each other, and if they do not, it's only for a season. He gives an example here of devoting themselves to prayer. If you need to come apart, do it with what? Mutual consent? Only for a season that you can devote yourselves to prayer. Cindy? Okay. That's the other point. They each have authority over each other's bodies. A woman doesn't have authority over her body, the man does. Man doesn't have authority over his body, the woman does. So what does that tell us about our daily interaction?
You're individuals, but you're also one entity
Okay.
as a couple. I mean, to me, I see the separating core purpose of prayer, like maybe prayer was inclusive of praying in fasting, not just saying a prayer. I want to say a prayer. I don't want to be with you. No,
Right.
if you're going to fast, that is as personal as it can be between you and God. Except if you are married and you're fasting, you need to consult and make sure you have permission because your body belongs to another.
Okay.
And that is something that you would give up during that day or those days. And you do need to have permission.
Okay.
And you need to be on the same page. And that's what marriage is. Marriage is two individuals. You don't give up your rights to be an individual. You're always an individual.
That's right. But in a marriage relationship, the other one comes first, right? Okay. Yes. That's right. That's right. If you didn't hear, basically, we need to consider the other person in everything that we do. Not just when we're in the house, not when we're just talking about the sexual relationship. In everything we do, we must consider the other person because, we are one together, even though we're individuals. Denny? That's right. And the vows we take, we become one. Exactly. All right. What position does one put their spouse in if they withhold sexual activity? Temptation. Absolutely. Yeah. If the one that's withholding may not be tempted, but certainly the other one very well could be. Could be. Are there other temptations that we can put our spouse in? I heard a yes. Anybody, you want to expand on that? Okay. Okay. Eve is an example. She was the mechanism that her husband was tempted by what she did. So yes, there are other things that we can do to cause temptation to our spouse within a marriage, certainly. Why is this one, or is it more important? Okay. Okay. This can break the relationship, make it irreparable. The sexual urges that God gives us are so strong. It can be irreparable damage done if that is not in place. Yes, sir.
This due benevolence I've seen, and maybe a lot of others have seen, I'm not sure, but it seems like it's something that has been used by men to just make the sexual union a demanding kind of thing, almost a force kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it has been a force, and it's never that. I mean, it's not love. If it's just a physical thing and that's all it is, you can't force. This to say she has to do this. Well, and it's whatever. I think people can go too far.
You mean we can't demand our rights, huh?
Yeah, you can't. Yeah.
That's certainly not the way to go about it. Yeah. Again, when he talks about the marriage relationship, in other places, they talk about the love we have for each other. And that certainly does not go along with demanding our rights as a husband or a wife.
That's what God demanding us to love him. He does not demand. I mean, he does, but he doesn't come down and physically force us to love him.
Yeah.
He gives us all kinds of things that makes us want to.
I think most people in their early marriage understand that it's not something you demand, it's not your right, but it's something that each should give to each other. If we look at more of a giving than a receiving, I think we'd be much better off in that relationship. Exactly right. Putting the Lord's first. Our society has a warped sense of love. It's crazy. It's almost completely opposite what the Lord talks about with love. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Okay. Yes, Jerry. Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. And that's so prevalent in our society. You know, I want what's right for me, period. Jim? Mm-hmm. That's right. Absolutely. Okay. Paul says this as a concession, not a commandment, in verse 6. What does he mean by that? Denny? Okay. It's not to be forced upon you, something you should consider. What else? It's a suggestion from Paul. It did not come as a command from God. It was a suggestion by Paul. It's a sound suggestion, obviously. You know, it's a healthy suggestion. But Paul says this is not a commandment from God. But again, Paul says he wished that all men were like him in this regard. And he's referring to the fact that he was single, he did not have a wife. And certainly that is permissible. That is just fine. He said he had a gift. What is this gift he was talking about? He did not have that strong of a drive. Exactly. And most of us know people like that. That is just something that's not in them. That's not important, and that's fine. We're going to find out that Paul had a special reason for that. And speaking about this day and time now, how is the sexual desire promoted? In everything, isn't it? In everything. Chris? That's right. That's right. Sure. Exactly. Yeah. 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 This sexual is promoted in everything we see. I mean, commercials, cars, buying a car, say a pretty girl in a car, or a good-looking man driving a car. That's going to all of a sudden make you want to drive that car. Just in everything. So you can't get around it. Sex sells. No doubt about it. Why did Paul think it would be good to remain unmarried? Okay, so you can focus on pleasing God. Was there a particular reason during this time that he felt that way?
People were about to get killed for their faith.
Okay. Persecution.
Locked up in prison.
Yeah.
Separated from your spouse by the government.
Isn't it interesting that Paul was one of those who was kind of in on the beginning of the persecution? And now he's telling people it's better remain unmarried because of this situation. And certainly at this time, early 50s, persecution was ramping up, and it was just going to get worse. So it was Paul's opinion that it's best if you do not get married. All righty. But, and at the end of that verse, or in verse 9, but if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. If that desire is so strong in you, go ahead and marry. For it is better to marry than to burn. And this says burn with passion, although the authors I looked at said there was no Greek word for passion, which is kind of hard to believe, but that's what they say. So what does it mean to that it's better to marry than to burn with passion? With lust, okay? Okay. Have that mind in you where that's all you think about? That's all you crave? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's if you can't control yourself, get married. Basically, is what he's saying. Okay, Paul wanted the Christians to keep their marriage vows. And what reason did he give? Verses 10 and 11. He says, a wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. Why did he say that to him? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Any other reason? Exactly. Yeah. You were married. You took your vows before the Lord. And people in the world don't think about that. They don't think about making a vow not only to your spouse but also to the Lord to remain in that position. What else? Yes, sir. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. It's better to marry than to sin. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Is there another reason why you should not depart? Who else might be involved in this? Family. Yeah, children. You might have children involved in this. That's why it's always better to stay together. And he goes on talking then about what happens when a spouse departs. There's hardships. Yep, absolutely. What else? Temptations, possible temptations. When one spouse departs, what happens to the other spouse? They can be tempted as well. Maybe the spouse departed because they were tempted by somebody else, but when you leave that one, they're tempted as well. So people don't often think about what position they're putting that other spouse in when they separate. And of course, as we talked about, if there's children involved, it just ruins the household. Just makes it very, very difficult on the house. And bottom line, it's not God's plan. God's plan is for two to be together. Yes, sir. Exactly. Yeah. Right. That's the options he gives to these people. If a spouse leaves, then they either need to be reconciled or they remain unmarried. You know. By this passage, I don't believe so. I think the same thing. Is on the man too, as well, to remain unmarried. Yeah. Again, going back to Matthew, when Jesus talked about remarriage, divorced remarriage, that's the only reason is unfaithfulness by the other partner. And I think this is perfectly in line with that, what Paul's talking about here. Okay. And let's see where I am. If a non-believing spouse stays with a believer, what does Paul say will happen? If a non-believing spouse stays with a believer. Okay, that's the ideal situation. Yeah. That the unbeliever, through their life, through their actions, can help to convert the unbeliever. But what else happens if he doesn't obey the gospel, the other spouse? What happens with him? Okay, look in verses 13 and 14. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. So what does he mean when he says the unbeliever is sanctified by the believer? Jim? Okay, that's the reason for staying together. Okay. 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 You're safe. Let me give you this question. What happened when a Jewish woman married a Gentile man? Or vice versa? Remember what happened in the old law?
The children become as though they're Gentiles.
That's right. The children become unclean because it's a mixed marriage. This was the Jewish law. The children became unclean because of the marriage. But what is he saying here when he says the unbeliever is sanctified? Okay. Okay. The children are holy. They're not unholy or basically they're not a part of the religious order. They're still not considered unclean or unholy. But what about that word sanctified? We're sanctified, aren't we, when we obey the gospel? What does it mean to be sanctified? Set apart. It means to be set apart. So if this woman, by being a Christian, marries a man who's not, and they stay together, it says he is sanctified. What does that mean? Does that mean he's saved? It doesn't mean he's sanctified in the way Christians are sanctified, does it? Okay. But there is some confusion here, yeah. It's not extremely clear. But the idea is, remember, as I said, the Jewish, they were considered unclean. That's not the case here. Their marriage is considered a normal marriage. The husband is sanctified by the fact that he is part of the family. He is not considered unclean. He's not a Christian, but he's still considered, he's not outcast, in other words, as the Jews would be in the Jewish law.
That's what I was wanting to hear was, it's not necessarily that he's good, he's just not bad. He's not condemned because of the marriage.
Exactly, because of the marriage, yeah.
He's not bad,
Exactly.
he's not unclean, he's not bad, he's not like it would have been under the Jewish religion. He would have been.
That's right.
But now, it's not that he's saved, but he's not condemned because of the marriage.
Right.
That's the only thing I can make out of this.
Yeah. Jerry? Exactly. Yep. Exactly. Yep. Yeah. If you didn't hear, a good example of that is Timothy. His mother was a Jew, his father was a Greek, yet they were completely accepted as Christians. And so that's a great example. And of course, Timothy went on to be a preacher. So it's even better. It's even better. Yeah. You have a question? Okay. That's the idea. The Christian, by the manner of their life, the way they act, the way they treat their spouse, the way they live a Christian life will be attractive to their spouse and hopefully eventually convert them. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Cindy says that this example is her own family. Father was non-Christian. Her mother took the kids to church every Sunday and presented her life as a Christian. And eventually her husband realized this, met with somebody else, a Christian, who was able to teach him. And even unknown to the kids, he was studying and eventually became a Christian, primarily because of looking at her life, at her life. And so turned out he became a deacon and an elder in the church. So absolutely works. Did he?
Because of this topic, and the power in this topic, I'd like to make a point that I think the overlooking issue of centuries. People have a tendency to apply this to general marriages in general. All right for Christians, all right for believers. This is what he is expecting, or what God is expecting from believers. People want to apply this to people that are married outside of Christ, people who don't even know Christ. They want to make the same application of all these principles. And they shouldn't do that, but they do. But I'm just going to make sure that they understand that who is addressing this.
Yeah, he's addressing it to Christians. Absolutely. Okay, continuing now, down in verse, we got 3 minutes to cover about 8 verses. What does Paul mean here when he talks about his calling? He says, but as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. What is he talking about there? Okay, being single, possibility. What else? In this particular conversation, I think that's what he's talking about, being single. But he also applies it to other things. He says, if anyone comes and has been circumcised, what does he say? It's okay, don't try to become uncircumcised. And if you're uncircumcised, don't try to become circumcised. He said, the physical condition you're in doesn't matter. These physical things don't matter. He even talks about being a slave. He says, if you're a slave, remain as a slave. Now he gives a caveat to that. What's that caveat? If you're able to be freed, take advantage of it. Yes, that's fine. But be content where you are. Physically, the position you're in, stay in that position. Don't try to fight. Because I'm a Christian now, I have all these rights. He's saying, no, your right is because you're a Christian, you're a free man. And what does he say to those who are Christians? You are a slave. So if you're a Christian, you are a slave, but you're a slave to Christ. You're a slave to Christ now. Brother. Yes, that's right. That's right. Don't try to change your physical position just because you're a Christian. Be a Christian where you are. Now, if you're able to make changes, fine, go ahead. But don't fight for those changes because you're a Christian. Be a Christian where you are. Remember, he says, if you're a Christian and you're a slave, you're a free man in Christ. But if you're in Christ, you're still a slave. But you're a slave to Christ. That's the bottom line. All right, thank you all very much for your participation.